go ahead and dive right in. One of the first things that I, again, mentioned is that monitor calibration. So let's take a look at sort of an example, if you will, of the importance of monitor calibration. So here I'm just simulating the process because, of course, I have calibrated my monitor display. I actually use an i1 Display Pro. The Color Monkey is another great product. There are a variety of tools out there, but as long as you're calibrating, you're going to help make sure that you're getting an accurate picture of what you're looking at, your images on the screen. So here I've sort of simulated a bad calibration, a horrible calibration, this tremendously blue-looking appearance. But just to illustrate the point, if I have an adjustment that, if I have a display that is not calibrated, I'm not seeing an accurate reflection of the photo itself. And so when I apply my adjustments, I think that I'm improving the appearance of the photo. So in this case, shifting toward yellow to get rid of that strong blue cast. But in fact, I'm applying an adjustment based on an inaccurate view of the display itself, of the images themselves. And so if I now turn off that faking for a moment, so I'm just using a split toning adjustment in order to simulate that bad appearance, you can see that now once I've calibrated the display so that the display is accurate, the adjustments I applied are making this image far too yellow. And so again, if I'm not seeing the image accurately, then I'm not going to get the best result. So I want to make sure first and foremost that what I see is accurate. The next step beyond calibrating your display is to make sure that you're getting the best information possible out of your camera. And of course, I recommend shooting in RAW. For one thing, that helps make sure that you're going to get the best image quality. And that comes from a few different things. Number one, by shooting in RAW, you're getting greater bit depth. Most cameras today, I would say, are capturing in RAW at a 14-bit per channel mode or bit depth. Some cameras shoot at 16-bit per channel, some are still at 12-bit per channel, but a JPEG capture is only 8 bits per channel, and that translates into more posterization. But the RAW capture also gives you a lot more flexibility. So just to give you an example, this is a very real scenario. I had to go find an image where a situation occurred where the camera produced a bad effect. So here, this was the camera's fault. I promise you, I did not have any issues with my own settings on the camera, but somehow when the sun entered the frame, as I was panning, following this airplane, really just to get a picture of it, you can see the exposure was way, way off. But because I'm shooting in RAW, I can actually pull back the exposure, and there's quite a bit of information that's actually in that image. So there we've got a result where the RAW capture was bad, and we're able to pull back that exposure. Well, in terms of color, we also have a benefit to RAW capture. So let's take a look at an example here. We have a variety of situations where, well, in this case, simulated once again, because I'm faking everything essentially to illustrate some of these concepts. But I have a set of photos. Conceptually, these could have been all different photos captured at different moments, but with different in-camera settings for the white balance or the color temperature. So if you take a look up here, I've got a preset established for the white balance over on the right panel here in the develop module on the right panel. And so if I go to the next image, you'll see that that one is set to cloudy, and the next image is set to shade. And then we get to tungsten, obviously an inaccurate white balance preset for this image. And then we also have fluorescent. Obviously, there was no fluorescent lighting in this particular case, but you can see those presets produce different colors. So I'm compensating for different color circumstances, for different lighting conditions on the same image. And really what this boils down to in terms of RAW capture is that it doesn't matter what you set your white balance to in the camera, at least as far as image quality is concerned. When you set a white balance setting in the camera for a RAW capture, that's just a metadata value. All that does is establish the default color setting for the image. You can adjust the image after the capture as much as you'd like in terms of that white balance, the temperature and tint adjustments, and there's no penalty in terms of image quality. So in fact, I could select all of these images. I'll go ahead and turn on the automatic sync option, and we'll just set all of these to, let's set them to the cloudy option. And because I've turned on that auto synchronization, you can see that all of the images are updated for that cloudy preset, and all of the images now will have the exact same color with no reduction in image quality. So that RAW capture gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of adjusting the color after the capture, which can be very helpful. Now, obviously, in most cases, we're going to have pretty good color right from the start. We're going to have pretty good exposure right from the start. So hopefully we don't need all of those benefits of raw capture, but I'd rather have the benefit and not need it than to wish I'd had it if I had shot in JPEG. And frankly, more to the point, the biggest reason that I don't shoot JPEG is that with a JPEG image, you always have compression, so there's the risk of compression artifacts, so loss of image quality, as well as that 8-bit bit depth that I mentioned previously. I also think it's tremendously helpful to understand color. So I find that a lot of photographers don't really understand how color works, the relationships between colors. Now, to be sure, color is a tremendously complicated subject. And so I wouldn't expect, unless you're interested in pursuing a degree in physics, I wouldn't suggest that you're going to necessarily truly understand everything there is to know about color. But that said, there is still something to be said for having at least a basic understanding of color models, for example. So I imagine we're all familiar with the basic red, green, blue color model. Let's take this image over into Photoshop, and we can play with it just a little bit and get a better sense of exactly how these colors interact. So RGB, or red, green, blue, those are the primary colors for emitted light. In other words, the color that's being presented on your display and digital projectors. Anytime where light is creating the image, you can think of red, green, and blue as our primaries. That's what's used as primaries in most cases with emitted light. Not always, not exclusively, but very commonly. Well, so we have red light. This is red light at maximum intensity, green light, and blue light, and those light levels can mix and match so that we're able to see a combination of red and green light, for example, to produce yellow. We're able to mix blue and green to produce cyan, and if we mix all of those colors at their maximum intensities, then we get pure white, at least in theory. Notice that we also have those overlapping complementary colors. Those happen to be the primary colors for emitted light. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. We have another image with the primary colors for the emitted light, or for reflected light rather. So this would be for printing. So you may be familiar that for printing we have cyan, magenta, and yellow. CMYK, the K is black, the key color, really just added because we don't have pure enough inks to be able to produce all of those colors in a pure black with only cyan, magenta, and yellow. But let's go ahead and send this image over into Photoshop as well so that we can take a look at how those colors interact with each other. And again, this is ink on paper, so everything's going to start getting darker when we mix those colors together, and at least in theory, we'll end up with black when we combine all of those colors. So using these sort of sample images, these illustrations, we're able to get at least a basic sense of how these colors operate. One of the tricks that I think can be very helpful is to just bring up the color picker inside of Photoshop. So just click on that foreground color swatch down on the toolbox inside of Photoshop, and now you can explore the various color models. So we have HSB, for example, sometimes referred to as HSL. We'll see an example of that later. That's hue, saturation, and brightness, or lightness, or luminance. And so we can see how the hue, the basic color, plus the saturation levels, plus the relative brightness levels for the image create an overall color. We see red, green, blue, RGB, which we were just talking about. CMYK is also represented here, and also lab color, LAB, lightness or luminance, and then the A channel and the B channel. That's actually what we're going to be using in just a moment to adjust color inside of Lightroom. You might not have known it, but when you're adjusting temperature and tint, you're effectively working in the lab color model. So let's go ahead and get back over into Lightroom. We'll take a look at these color wheels here. Again, the color wheel is just a representation of color to help us better understand color. Typically we have red up at the top, or the 0 degrees around the color wheel position, and we can move around that color wheel. More importantly, when we're adjusting color, we're moving across the color wheel. So we can shift between red and cyan, for example, to shift the overall appearance of color in the photo. So a little more red, a little more cyan. It's important to keep in mind that when we're applying these color adjustments, in general, we're affecting the entire image. And so we're shifting all pixel values toward a more reddish color or a more cyan color. If we're working in the lab color model, then, which is what we're using when we apply a temperature or tint adjustment, we're actually operating with 2 axes. A lot of photographers that I talk to are more comfortable with using the RGB color model as opposed to using lab color. But the reality is that you can get to any destination in terms of color with either approach. So yes, we have an extra axis, you might say, when it comes to RGB color, but we can still navigate around this color wheel, moving in any direction we want by using those other two sliders. So sometimes it might feel like it's more restrictive using only two sliders rather than three, but I assure you, you can still achieve any desired color adjustment in terms of that overall color balance using temperature and tint. You don't need to have RGB, but I will show you how to get to it inside of Lightroom if you choose, if you decide that's a better approach or that makes more sense for you personally. Another thing that I think is helpful to understand or to keep in mind when it comes to color, and especially if you're trying to develop an eye for color to practice your work when it comes to color adjustment, then I think that memory colors is a really good concept to understand. And the basic idea of memory colors is that based on our own experience in the world, we know what the correct color for specific objects is. So we all know the yellow, or at least I imagine all of us know, the yellow of a ripe banana. And we all know that sort of greenish yellow of a not yet ripe banana, and the specific brown of a banana that's gotten overripe. And so with those colors, that concept of memory colors, if we pay attention to objects that develop colors that where the colors are sort of important in terms of accuracy, we can think about memory colors in terms of how we approach the color and better understanding when we've achieved good color. So skin tones are an excellent example of where memory colors are very important. If you're adjusting images of people, it is critically important that those colors be accurate. Now, accurate can be a little bit of a range because the lighting could vary. Maybe everything looks a little bit more yellowish because the photo was captured under golden hour, very yellow lighting conditions, warm lighting conditions, or maybe it's very cool because it was a photo captured in the shade. But the point is that we want those colors to be accurate. And so when you're evaluating colors, it can be very helpful, especially as you're learning to better adjust color in your images. Work with a subject where you know what accurate color looks like so that you can better evaluate your results as you're working with color. So let's take a look at the basic approach to color, essentially color balance inside of Lightroom, and that is primarily achieved through white balance. Now there are several ways that we can approach white balance in terms of adjusting the color in the photo inside of Lightroom. So I'm going to show you all three very quickly, but I'm going to focus on the final result, the actual approach that I take. As we saw previously, we do have a white balance pop-up, and so we can choose a white balance preset. Now these are essentially the same options that you'll find in the camera. So you can essentially tell Lightroom what the lighting conditions were so that it can compensate accordingly. So if you think that the lighting was fluorescent lighting, you can choose that option. Lightroom will apply an adjustment to compensate for the color of fluorescent light. And of course, that in this case is very wrong, but that is an option that's available. So maybe I say, well, okay, it was sort of daylight, or I want it to be just a little bit more golden, so I'm going to choose cloudy just to make it a little bit more golden. But here we're just choosing presets, and my feeling is that I'm always going to want to fine-tune things a little bit using the temperature and tint sliders, so I don't bother with the preset, I just go directly to the sliders. We also have an eyedropper. I can click that eyedropper and then move out into the image and click on an area of that photo that I think should be perfectly neutral gray. And if I don't click on the right spot, I can get some very wild colors. My problem here is that, number one, now I have to go find something that I want to be perfectly neutral. And more often than not, I don't want anything to be perfectly neutral. I probably got up early or stayed out late for golden light, so I don't want a white object to appear white or a gray object to appear gray. Rather, I want those subjects to take on a little bit of a golden lighting to them. And so once again, in theory, I could use that eyedropper, and in some cases, to be sure, I do need absolute neutral color values for certain areas of a scene, and so that eyedropper could be helpful. But in general, I don't like this approach because it's not that precise, and again, I'm going to want to fine-tune things just a little bit. So for me, since I'm going to end up at the temp and tint sliders, temperature and tint, I might as well just start there. One little tip, if you feel that you don't have a good eye for color, swing these sliders through their extremes. So here's the maximum yellow value, the maximum setting for temperature. Here's the minimum setting for temperature. So here's our moonlit night, and here's golden hour extreme. Well, we know that both of those are not a good result, but by swinging through those extremes, you're able to sort of develop your eye to get a better sense for what the best color in the photo is, starting off by understanding what the best color in the photo is not. This is way too blue. This is way too yellow. And as I start to kind of settle down, moving that slider a little bit less and less, I can slowly fine-tune it down to a point that I think is a little bit more accurate, or at least more pleasing. So accuracy, again, is sort of more of a range. There's absolute accuracy, but as a photographer, I'm more interested in reproducing what I feel that setting looked like. So I'm trying to make it reasonably accurate, again, obeying that concept of memory colors, but adding a little creative touch as well, maybe warming things up just a hair. And then, of course, I can adjust the tint. Now, with temperature, we've got a little more artistic flexibility here. I might warm things up just a little more than I otherwise would, or more than the lighting really looked when I was out there photographing. With tint, this one really is more just purely corrective, not creative. So more green, more magenta, probably not a color tint you're going to want to apply to an image. So again, swinging through those extremes so that you develop that eye for when the color is inaccurate, and then settling down and trying to find the optimal position. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm working with the mouse using the temperature and tint sliders, sometimes I don't do a very good job of getting those sliders exactly where I want them. And so instead, what I'll do is first use the sliders to get myself pretty close to accurate colors. I think we're in pretty good shape here, but it could use to be fine-tuned just a little bit. Once I'm to that point, then I'll click inside the field that shows the numeric value for whichever adjustment it is that I'm working with. In this case, we'll work with the tint slider. And then I can use a keyboard shortcut in order to change that value. So I can press up arrow on the keyboard to increase the value, and I can press the down arrow on the keyboard to decrease the value. And if I need a little bit bigger adjustment, I can add the shift key. So shift up arrow will apply a big increase in the value, and shift down arrow will apply a big decrease in the value. Now, in this case, the values that we're talking about are integers, meaning we're increasing by 1 if we press the up arrow, and decreasing by 1 if we press the down arrow. And we apply a 10x factor if we hold the shift key. So holding the shift key, I'm increasing by 10 at a time with up arrow and decreasing by 10 at a time with the down arrow. That's true for most of the adjustments if they're using an integer value. The temperature slider is a little bit different because the numbers are just a lot bigger, and so we'll have different changes in terms of those values, but the same concept still applies. Holding the shift key and up and down arrow to get big adjustments, and then just the up and down arrow keys by themselves to get smaller adjustments. And so I find that to be very, very helpful in terms of making sure that I'm getting the best color and that I can actually get to that result effectively if I'm having a little trouble getting the best result, getting the best adjustment using my mouse. So obviously this color could use to be adjusted a little bit further. Right about there looks to be pretty accurate. We'll call that good for the moment, and we'll move on to our next image where we take a look at one of my favorite sliders in Lightroom, one of my favorite adjustment controls, and that is Vibrance. Vibrance is essentially the saturation adjustment with a little bit of self-control built in. And that self-control operates in two ways. One, it protects skin tones, and it also serves to do what I call equalize the colors in the image. So if we increase Vibrance, we're increasing saturation, but we're increasing the saturation for the colors that are not very saturated to a greater extent than the colors that are already saturated. So if I just increase saturation, all of the colors get an equal boost. And if I reduce saturation, all those colors get an equal reduction in saturation. With Vibrance, in this particular image, you might be able to see that the blues in the sky are getting a bigger increase in saturation than are the yellow flowers, because that Vibrance adjustment is having a stronger effect on the colors that need it the most, on the colors that are not as saturated. As a result of how that Vibrance control works, I can usually get away with a much stronger adjustment with Vibrance before I start to create any problems. Now, because of that uneven effect, sometimes I need a very strong increase in Vibrance to achieve a good balance of colors in terms of their saturation levels in the photo, but then the overall image looks a little bit over-processed. And so a great way to deal with that is to start off with that vibrance increase. It can be a really large increase just to equalize the overall color levels in terms of saturation, and then apply a negative value to saturation to bring the overall value down. So we're able to equalize the color but then fine-tune. So that combination of vibrance plus saturation can be incredibly helpful. I love that vibrance adjustment. It's tremendously helpful in terms of bringing up the overall colors, bringing the colors that need the most adjustment up to a higher saturation level, but then we can fine-tune with the saturation. So I see there was a question actually about the auto color temperature. So let me take a brief step backward just to address that because I didn't mention it. On the pop-up, you'll see that we have an auto option for white balance. You may be familiar with the auto setting in your camera. So when you're shooting RAW, you can set an auto white balance, and your camera will attempt to establish settings for the temperature, the overall white balance adjustment based on the lighting conditions that it perceives, based on the color of that light. In Lightroom, we can choose this auto option. It's the same concept. It's just auto in your camera is your camera choosing what that setting ought to be. Auto in Lightroom is Lightroom choosing what the setting ought to be. Let's go ahead with this image and see what it does. Well, I think for my money that's a little bit too magenta and way too neutral. The clouds became really gray. So once again, auto is another option on that pop-up, but I don't like using the pop-up because I'd rather just get directly to the image itself and fine-tune that temperature and tint based on a visual evaluation of the photo. All right, so let's move on to tone curve. So I did promise that I would show you how you can get RGB color balance inside of Lightroom. You'll notice that we're using temperature and tint. You'll recall that that represents our lab color model. What about RGB? It is nowhere to be found, at least on the surface. But if we go down to the tone curve, we can actually adjust color using the RGB, or red, green, blue color model. What I need to do first is click my RGB pop-up. Now, if you're not in the point curve option, you need to switch to that. So if you're seeing a set of sliders, first click the button at the bottom right of the tone curve to get back into that point curve mode. Then we can choose red, green, or blue. So for example, we'll go with green to start with. Green is the primary color, red, green, blue. The opposite is magenta. So green and magenta are opposite colors. So if I increase the value for green, I'm increasing the appearance of green in the photo. If I reduce the value for green, I'm reducing green, but I'm also moving in the opposite direction, so that takes us to a more magenta result. And so I'm just dragging the curve upward or downward. Upward to increase the value for that color, in this case green, downward to decrease the value for that color. In this case, since we're working with green, less green equals more magenta. Let's go ahead and switch to the blue channel so we can switch between blue by increasing the value, moving that slider up or moving the curve up, and yellow by moving that curve downward. I can emphasize that adjustment on the darker areas or on the brighter areas of the photo, depending on exactly where I position my anchor points on the curve. I can even do some very sophisticated things, increasing the amount of blue in the shadows, for example, and decreasing the amount of blue in the highlights. Basically, what that boils down to is that I can make a tremendous mess out of my photo very quickly, but it also means that I can be very sophisticated with my color adjustments in the photo. And so that tone curve can certainly be helpful, not just for bringing back, as it were, the RGB approach, that red, green, blue approach to color balance, but also for applying a little bit more sophisticated color adjustments. So I also love having control over the individual colors inside of Lightroom. So scrolling down a little bit further, over on the right panel in the Develop module, we'll find the HSL option for hue, saturation, and luminance, or lightness. And we have sliders for hue, saturation, and luminance. And you'll notice that for each of those sliders, for each of those sections, we have sliders for individual colors. So I can adjust the hue of the reds, the hue of the oranges, the hue of the yellows. So this gives me some interesting possibilities. So for example, if I want to make my sky look a little bit more purple, maybe I shift the blues up toward a more purple value, take the purples up to a more magenta value. Now I've got this pinkish sky, but I've adjusted the sky without affecting the landscape down below or the airplane in the foreground. I could obviously change that airplane, take the yellows and make them a little bit more orange. obviously in this case just having a little bit of fun with the photo and illustrating the concept, but we can most certainly fine-tune overall colors to make them more pleasing. So maybe I do want to take that yellow and shift it toward a little bit more of a pure yellow. I don't need a big adjustment, just a very small shift of hue, and we get a little more kind of a pure yellow color for the airplane. I can take the saturation for just the yellows and increase or decrease that saturation. So I'm able to apply adjustments to specific color ranges. Now inside of Lightroom, I'm not able to actually change the definition of those colors. In Photoshop, we could use the hue saturation adjustment and redefine specific color ranges, but still, even without the ability to change the definition of specific colors, we can exercise quite a bit of control here. Maybe I take those greens and make them a little bit more kind of pure green, perhaps increase the saturation for those greens a little bit. Maybe I want to darken the sky. I can take the blues and the aquas and darken them down just a little bit. You get the idea. We're able to choose specific colors and adjust the hue. Again, that's degrees around the color wheel, so it's sort of like applying a very basic color balance adjustment to specific colors in our images. Saturation to adjust the intensity of those colors or how pure those colors are. And then luminance for overall brightness of the colors. I do caution, though, be careful when it comes to luminance, because a little can go a long way, and you'll start to have sort of a muddy appearance if you get too aggressive with those luminance adjustments for individual colors. And taking that a step further, let's take a look at a real-world example where just a small adjustment in a small detail of the photo can make what I think is a big difference. One of the things that I don't like in this image is way off in the distance. If I pay careful attention, I can see that there's a bit of kind of a purple cast out in that background area. And to me, that's just, it doesn't look very accurate. Yes, I know this is red rock country, and therefore there's lots of those reddish tones in the rock, but a lot of that purple in the background is really just atmospheric scatter, and so I want to try to tone that down. Let's first go ahead and increase the saturation for the colors that I think are being affected. In this case, that would be the purples and the magentas in terms of the sliders here in the HSL section. Again, specifically saturation in this case. And what I'm doing is increasing the value so I can sort of troubleshoot. Am I working with the correct sliders? And perhaps more importantly, is am I able then to apply an adjustment to the area that I want to fix without causing problems somewhere else in the photo. And so in this case, I'll go ahead and zoom back out, and we can confirm that the only area being affected by that saturation increase, by and large, is that area in the background. And furthermore, by reducing the saturation to improve the appearance of that area of the photo, I'm not going to create any other problems. So if there had been a bush in the foreground with beautiful red flowers, reducing the saturation for the purples and the magenta might affect those flowers, causing a problem for me. I would have to take a different approach in that case. But here, no problem at all, and so I can reduce the saturation for purple and magenta. In theory, I could take that value all the way down to get gray in the area in the background. Obviously, that would not look very good, and so instead I'll just reduce a fairly strong amount, not too strong that I start to look muddy and gray in that area, but just to tone down those colors just a little bit. We can also get a little bit more sophisticated in terms of our overall adjustments. So in terms of applying targeted adjustments, adjustments that affect just specific areas of the photo, I should mention, as long as we're looking at HSL, we can also go into black and white mode, and by choosing B and W now, instead of having colors for hue, saturation, and luminance, we just have a black and white mix. That allows us to brighten or darken areas of the photo based on their underlying color. And so, for example, I can increase the brightness for the reds or decrease. And notice also I have this little target icon up at the top left. That's available for several of the adjustments inside of Lightroom, and it allows us to work directly on the image. So I'll go ahead and click on that target and move my mouse out into the image. And now as I hover over the car, for example, if you take a look over on the right panel, you'll see that under black and white mix, the red value, the red slider, is essentially being highlighted. That indicates what color I'm hovering over in the image. It also indicates if I directly adjust the photo while I'm working inside of the image in that position, that I'll be affecting the red. So I can just enable that on-image adjustment feature, come out into the image, and click and drag upward to brighten or downward to darken for specific color values. So I can point to the car. I don't have to remember what color the car was. I can just point to it and increase the value for, in this case, the brightness, the luminance value for the black and white mix based on red. We have the same basic adjustment available elsewhere, so including in HSL, you'll see that I can adjust the hue, the saturation, or the luminance directly on the image just by enabling that targeted adjustment, that on-image adjustment feature, and then working directly on the photo, just clicking and dragging. But now I can also paint an adjustment into the image. So if I'm having a hard time, if HSL isn't quite giving me what I need and I want to apply a specific adjustment to a specific area of the photo, then I can work with my various adjustments. Now we do have a gradient adjustment, the graduated filter, we have a radial filter, and we have the adjustment brush. So I can apply, for example, an adjustment in a gradient fashion. Here I have a strong exposure adjustment applied. I'll go ahead and reduce that value and maybe just bring it up a hair and increase the value for clarity and maybe boost the saturation and take that temperature and tint. And so I'm able to fine-tune, in this case, in theory at least, the color. Obviously, I'm just kind of playing with these sliders, but I can apply that adjustment in a gradient fashion. I'll go ahead and reset that adjustment, and we'll come back to the radial adjustment where we can apply that radial filter, an adjustment that affects a specific area, either inside of an ellipse, or if I invert the mask with the invert mask checkbox over on the right panel, then I can apply the adjustment to just the interior area. So I can choose the interior versus exterior of that ellipse. So in this case, obviously working with the exterior, I can adjust the overall shape and move that shape, that ellipse, around within the image, and then of course fine-tune all of my various settings. Maybe I wanted to vignette the image just a little bit, or whatever the case might be. But what's really powerful is that adjustment brush. So I'm going to go ahead and reset that adjustment, and we'll switch to the adjustment brush. And now let's assume, for example, that I wanted to adjust the appearance of just the car. With the adjustment brush, I can come out into the car. Once again, I start with an exaggerated adjustment. So you can see I have a very strong minus value for the exposure. So I can come into the image and just paint the adjustment. So if I wanted to adjust only the car, I could come into the car and paint over it, defining the area that I want to adjust, and then fine-tune my overall settings for that portion of the image. Of course, in this case, I didn't do a very good job of painting on the car. Fortunately, I don't have to because Lightroom can help me with that task. I'll go ahead and reset that adjustment and start again. This time I'm going to turn on the auto mask feature. So I'll turn on the auto mask checkbox. And now what I can do is come out to the image and position my mouse over, in this case, the car. And what I need to do is keep the center of my brush, of that circle, inside the car itself. But I need to have the edge of the car fall inside the circle as well. So I'm going to keep the center of the mouse inside the car, and I'm going to keep the edge of the car inside of the circle, so that essentially Lightroom then will evaluate within the circle of that brush and determine where the car is versus is not. So again, I'm applying an exaggerated exposure adjustment. I'll go ahead and click and paint across the car, and again, keeping the center of that brush inside the car, and you can see that it's doing a pretty good job of defining the edge of the car. Once I have the edge pretty well defined and I have a pretty good build-up here in terms of that mask, I can turn off the auto mask option, and then I'll reduce my brush size. I can reduce the brush size with the left and right square bracket key. So left square bracket key to reduce brush size, right square bracket key to increase brush size, and then I can paint within that masked area, so within the car in this case, to finalize, to improve that overall mask. So that looks pretty good for our purposes right now. Then I can go ahead and fine-tune my overall adjustment. So maybe I wanted to brighten up that car just a little bit. Maybe I want to tone down the saturation a little because it was getting a little overdone. Whatever adjustments I'd like to apply, maybe I'll apply some clarity just to enhance the detail of those cloud reflections on the hood. But again, point being is that I can apply those color adjustments as well as some other adjustments so I can get the color just the way I want it in terms of the overall color, the temperature versus the tint for that effective color balance adjustment, the overall saturation, as well as some of the other adjustments I might want to apply. So by understanding how these various adjustments work, I'm better able to approach the image. Now, of course, I still need to be thinking about what it is I'm trying to accomplish in the image. So that concept again of memory colors can certainly be helpful in terms of evaluating the color in your photos. And then just thinking, and I think once you have a better understanding of what adjustments are actually available, and here we've really just touched on the adjustments that relate to color, and so there obviously are many other adjustments as well, but as you get a better understanding of what adjustments are actually available to you, you can use that to help inform your decisions about what specific adjustments you want to apply to your images. In other words, you have a better sense of the potential in terms of what adjustments are available. Then, of course, you can think even more about what are you actually trying to convey in the image. Do you want strong colors or more muted colors? Do you want to emphasize specific colors or specific subjects within the scene? And so by giving some thought to how you really want that image to be presented, and being very thoughtful about that, considering the various attributes of colors, the various colors that appear within your photo, and trying to make adjustments that suit whatever it is that you're trying to convey. Different images will have different moods, will express different feelings, different colors in different situations are going to be important. So giving some thought to what you're trying to convey, and then of course understanding what adjustments are available. Once you've accomplished that, though, obviously you're going to want to share your photos with others, or at least I hope you'll want to share your photos with others, and there are many ways that we can go about that, obviously. So let's talk about a couple of those methods. Two basic categories, I suppose you could say. There is the sort of digital sharing, and then we have the print sharing. So we'll talk about both. Let's take a look at an image that we might want to share, this image here. If I want to share this digitally, what I mean by that is share the image in a way that someone will be using emitted light to view the image. In other words, they'll look at that image on their monitor display, perhaps via a website, maybe on a social media website where someone is using their web browser to see your image, or they might be using a phone or some other device, maybe you're putting on a slideshow. Whatever the scenario, if you don't have control over exactly how the image is presented, one of the things you can do is convert that image to the sRGB color space. That's an option that's available to us when we're exporting or otherwise sharing an image in Lightroom, and it allows us to help ensure the best color for the photo. So what's the magic? Why is it that the sRGB color space is so helpful in terms of ensuring more accurate colors? It's actually twofold. Number one, the sRGB color space is pretty close to the color gamut, the overall range of colors available for most monitor displays. And so if the image is in an sRGB color space, there's a very good chance that any monitor, any display that your image might be viewed with will be able to present all of the colors in that image. In addition, the sRGB color space represents a pretty good estimation of the native color of a display. In other words, sRGB is a good color space to use in terms of a situation where there's no profile being employed. And there are still some web browsers that do not support color management, that will completely ignore a color space, a color profile that is embedded in your image. In those situations, or if color management is disabled, which is a setting in other web browsers, certain other web browsers, so if there's no color management, sRGB is going to help ensure a better display of your image. It's not going to be perfect. Let's not forget, if you haven't calibrated your display, then you are not getting an accurate picture necessarily of your images. But what about the other people who are viewing your images, who are not photographers, who don't even know what monitor calibration is? Well, for them, the color could be somewhat inaccurate. The luminance levels will almost certainly be inaccurate. Most displays, I find, are about a full stop too bright out of the box, or twice as bright as they really should be. And so you can essentially count on other people not having the most accurate view of your photos, but sRGB will help to some extent to mitigate those issues. So let's go ahead and switch to the library module, and we have some options under Publish Services to share to Facebook or to share to Flickr, for example, but I'm going to just export a photo. If we set up those Publish Services, then we can also set sRGB in most cases, or it will just be an automatic setting. It depends on the specific publish service, but they're the same basic settings that we have when we export an image. So if I want an export for purposes of emailing or posting to a website or blog or whatever the case might be, I can select one or more images and then click the export button to bring up the export dialog, and there we can specify our file setting. So for example, Perhaps I want to save a JPEG so that I can have a relatively small file to share online, and you can see that we're able to choose a specific color space. So we can choose sRGB, Adobe RGB, or ProPhoto RGB. ProPhoto RGB is great for working with your images in the first place. Adobe RGB is a good option if you're going to send an image out to be printed, although in some cases print workflows will be based around an sRGB color space as well, so it's good always to check with your printer. But when you're sharing an image digitally, posting to an online website or what have you, sRGB is your best bet. Everything else you can configure based on how large you want that image to appear, what metadata do you want to include, etc. But in terms of that color, changing the color space to sRGB whenever you're sharing or exporting an image in a digital form can be very helpful. When it comes to printing, there are some other issues. One of the things I hear very often from photographers, especially if I'm teaching a workshop and we're producing some prints, they'll make a print, and one of the first things I usually hear is that the print is too dark. And my first response is to turn on the lights, because generally you're going to get your best results, you'll have the best view of the images on your monitor display if you're working in a relatively dark environment. But remember, the print depends upon reflected light, and so you want to make sure that you are putting as much light onto that print as possible, essentially, when it comes to evaluating the level of detail, etc. So if you're in a darkened room, you've got to get some light onto the print to effectively evaluate it. But even then, you might find that in some situations you're not getting the best print in terms of those overall brightness levels. In many cases, photo inkjet printers are not capable of producing a full range of shadow values, and so we need to brighten up the image a little bit to compensate for that. Even with a good profile, we'll often end up with shadow areas that lack a bit of detail. And so by understanding the behavior of your printer, you'll be able to compensate for that, and Lightroom gives us the ability to actually apply that compensation. I'll go ahead and switch to the print module. Here I'm just producing a single image printed 8 by 10. I could adjust all of those print settings, of course, but then let's take a look first at our actual printer settings, our color management settings. Now we have two basic options. We can let the printer manage our colors, or we can choose a specific profile. At this point, I've not yet defined the profiles that I want to use, so they don't appear on the list, but I can go to the other option that will bring up a dialog where I can choose the specific profiles that have already been installed on my computer and that I want to use for print purposes. Now that profile defines the behavior of a specific printer, ink, and paper combination. But for our purposes, we can generally think of them as paper profiles for our specific printer. So for example, I have some profiles for an Epson Stylus Photo R3000 here. Photo Paper Glossy maybe is one of the papers that I want to use, and Premium Luster, and perhaps some of the other options I'd like to use, for example, the Velvet Fine Art paper. Whichever options I want to have available, I simply turn on the checkbox for that particular profile or for those profiles. I can then click OK, and now over on that right panel under Profile, we will have the profiles that I essentially enabled. Now, generally, you'll find that your printer comes with profiles for the papers from the same printer manufacturer. You can also go to the website of various paper manufacturers and find profiles for a wide variety of papers on a wide variety of printers, and those are generally available for most printers out there. And so you can download the profiles from the paper manufacturer's website and copy them to the appropriate location on your computer and then make them available inside of Lightroom. And that profile, again, is describing the behavior of that printer for a specific paper that you're printing to, a specific ink set. And so that's what helps the printer produce the most accurate result, is essentially sending corrected data. So you can have the printer manage that color, then you can apply adjustments inside the printer software. I would rather make use of a custom profile for the printer, ink, and paper combination that I'm using, and so I would choose. So let's just assume that I'm working with Velvet Fine Art paper, and I make a print. I'm going to use the perceptual rendering intent. We have perceptual versus relative, which is the relative colorimetric rendering intent. The short way to describe that, with perceptual, we're reducing the overall saturation of the image so that all colors are in gamut. In other words, so that all colors can be printed. With relative colorimetric, we're only changing the appearance of the colors that are beyond the capabilities of your printer for the specific ink and paper that you're using. Generally speaking, I prefer the relative option, but you could choose between the two. You can make sample prints with each and see what works better. In most cases, as long as you don't have a huge number of colors that are out of gamut, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, then you don't have to worry about this too terribly much. So again, in general, I prefer the relative colorimetric option, but perceptual works perfectly well in many cases also. But then you make a print and it's too dark. You've turned on the lights, it's still too dark. So how do we apply an adjustment there? We can simply turn on the print adjustment checkbox here and then adjust the brightness or the contrast. So I could increase or decrease the brightness, and I can increase the contrast. And what's most common is a need to increase the brightness a little bit. Again, this is compensating for the behavior of the printer, really. If the image was too dark, then you should go back to the develop module and apply some adjustments there. But if it's because of the behavior of the printer and the profile isn't quite getting the image the way you want it, it's still a little bit too dark, then you can apply the adjustment here, these print adjustment controls. Of course, as you might notice, we do not have a preview of that effect. So this is very much a trial and error operation. However, the benefit of this, or obviously the benefit is that you'll get a better print in terms of those overall brightness and possibly contrast levels, but generally speaking, you're compensating for the behavior of your specific printer, and so you should be able to find a setting that works well for virtually any print that you're producing. So once you've gone through that trial and error process, the same settings should work well for most, if not all, of your prints. But what about color? That's what we're really talking about today. What if the color is not accurate in that print? Well, then we want to evaluate our settings. Now, first thing, I want to go back and double check that all of my color management settings are correct inside of Lightroom. I also want to make sure that in the printer software, when I go to print the image, the dialog for my specific printer will appear. I want to make sure that color management is disabled. How you do that will vary depending on your specific printer, but check the manual on your printer. Make sure that you've disabled color management for the printer if you're using color management here inside of Lightroom. But if you're still not happy with the accuracy of the print and you know that everything was set correctly, then we can go back to the develop module and we can evaluate the image in the context of the actual print conditions. And so that calls for what we refer to as soft proofing. In other words, show me via software what the print will look like. I'll turn on the soft proofing checkbox. You see that I have an indication of proof preview up at the top right of the image, and also the boundary around the image has changed so that we now see white rather than gray, and that's essentially trying to mimic the paper itself. I'll bring back down what had been my histogram. Now that is soft proofing. You can see I still have a histogram, but I have my settings for printing. So these are the exact same settings that we would use when printing the image. Let's go ahead and choose that velvet fine art paper, for example, and you can probably see a rather dramatic change in the overall appearance of the photo. So it's much more kind of dingy, muddy. The colors are not as vibrant. Well, the reason for that is that I'm printing to a matte paper. It's a very good matte paper, but it's still a matte paper where the inks are going to get absorbed a little bit, and that reduces the overall saturation. So if you want vibrant colors, you're generally going to be best served by a glossy paper rather than a matte paper. There are some coated matte papers that perform very well, but generally speaking, the glossier the paper, the more vibrant the colors are capable of being. And so that will affect, so we can actually review different papers. So let's take a look at what this image would look like with premium luster paper. It looks much better in terms of contrast and overall saturation. Again, that's a matter of the nature of the paper, and Lightroom is essentially simulating what that paper is going to look like. I'm getting a sense of what the actual print will look like. I can even switch between relative colorimetric and perceptual for my rendering intent to see which one seems to work better for my specific output workflow, so for my specific printer ink and paper combination. And up at the top right of where that histogram had been, we can hover over or click to turn on a preview of where we're actually losing colors in the image. In other words, the areas of the image that are out of gamut. Well, clearly, in this case, with that velvet fine art paper, most of the image is out of gamut. In other words, most of the image represents colors that the printer is not capable of reproducing. And that's why the image in this case looked very muted. The colors looked very desaturated, essentially, because the printer ink and paper combination is simply not capable of producing those sorts of colors. They're just too saturated in this case. If I switch to premium luster, you'll see that most of the colors can be reproduced, and that's why the preview, the soft proof here, looks better. I don't know if you can even see very well, but in some of the yellow areas you can see that red highlight that indicates out of gamut. Just a very small number of very small areas of the photo where the colors go beyond the capabilities of the printer, ink, and paper combination I've chosen. Now, to some extent, we can compensate for that situation. So if I go back to my Velvet Fine Art paper, I can try to compensate. Maybe I want to try to reduce the overall saturation, for example, so that more colors will appear in gamut. If I take that down far enough, you can see first off that the red overlay starts to disappear, but you can also see that the colors are horribly muted. And so I think this really helps to underscore that by and large, if you're not able to produce a print that contains all of the colors that you really want, there's a very good chance that that is just a limitation of your specific printer, ink, and paper combination. Again, assuming you've applied good adjustments and assuming you're using a good workflow for optimizing the photo and for printing the photo. But you can apply some basic compensations. As soon as I try to make an adjustment, notice that Lightroom is saying, hey, wait a minute, do you want to make a virtual copy for soft proofing? Remember, by applying an adjustment here, I'm trying to compensate for the way the image is going to print in a specific condition, printer, ink, and paper. Right now, I'm applying adjustments aimed at improving a print to the Velvet Fine Art paper. Those same adjustments will not work well when I'm sharing the image on Facebook. They will not work well when I'm printing the image on a glossy paper. And so keep in mind that right now I'm soft proofing, I'm evaluating the image based on a specific print condition, and so I also then want to make adjustments that are exclusive to that print condition, thus the need for a proof copy or a virtual copy. So I'll go ahead and choose the Create Proof Copy option. You'll see that I now have a proof copy of my image. There's the original image. I'll go ahead and turn off soft proofing temporarily. There's the original image. Here's my proof copy at the moment with that very strong adjustment, reduction in saturation. But again, turning on soft proofing once again, as soon as I bring up that saturation, you see that the red indication that colors are out of gamut starts to show up again. I could try to shift the colors into color values that are going to work better for the print. So for example, taking the image into a more yellow value will cause the blue to be printable because now it's not really blue, but now we've made the yellows far too yellow, far too saturated, and so we're not able to reproduce those colors. So really what this boils down to, I realize this is maybe not the solution that many photographers are looking for, but part of the issue here is that we just have to understand the limitations of our output process. Sometimes that means that we will simply not use a particular process for a particular paper. That often means I might choose a particular paper based on the specific image that I'm printing. A photo like this that's very saturated, I'm not likely going to want to print it to a matte paper. I want to print it to a glossy paper. Whereas something that's a little bit more subtle in appearance, I might print to a matte paper, fine art paper. And so choosing papers based on the capabilities of the paper along with your printer and ink combination, but we can apply some fine-tuning adjustments. So if you have a situation like this where most of the colors in the image are out of gamut, all the adjustments in the world are not going to improve the situation. You need to probably choose a different paper. So be aware of those limitations, choose papers accordingly, but then when you do have a situation where maybe just a small number of colors are out of gamut, you can just let the workflow take care of that for you. Remember, the printer is going to try to reproduce, well, with software, with Lightroom's help. If we're using, for example, relative colorimetric as our rendering intent, remember, the colors that the printer is capable of reproducing will be reproduced exactly as they are. Only the colors that show as being out of gamut with this red overlay are going to be automatically adjusted to the closest matching color. So we can just let the printer and Lightroom do their work and evaluate the results, but we do have that ability within that soft proofing using a virtual copy to apply some at least minor adjustments to help improve, to help guide that process so that we can get a better sense. Maybe if I shift toward a little bit more blue, for example, maybe that still works, and if I increase the saturation just a little bit without losing too much of that color. In other words, I'm still limited by the capabilities of my printer, but with this soft proofing preview and using the virtual copy, I can then guide the adjustments. I can essentially specify how I want that image dealt with to produce the best print possible. And then when all else fails, use those memory colors. I'll go ahead and turn off soft proofing here. Use those memory colors as your guide. So when it comes to a print that is inaccurate, there are two basic causes there, two kind of categories of problems. One is your display. As we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, if you're not calibrating your display, if you don't have an accurate presentation of your images on your display, then your adjustments are not going to be accurate, and that would explain why the print doesn't look very good. You're getting a print that matches the image, you're just not seeing an accurate view of the image, and therefore you're applying inappropriate adjustments. So number one, you might revisit your display, recalibrate the display, make sure that that is accurate, and you can use an image that contains memory colors, sort of like this. This used to be the standard image that was used for this purpose. It's referred to as the PDI target, the Photodisc International Target image, and so this one goes back a long ways, but this is one of the images that's out there available to use for this purpose of evaluating memory colors. So you can use this in conjunction with calibrating your display to make sure that you have an accurate presentation on your display, and then print this image or an image similar to it with memory colors and see how that print looks. And that'll help you determine, is it the display or is it the printer that's causing the trouble? And then of course you need to delve a little more deeply into, especially when it comes to printing, what is the specific source? Do you have some clogged nozzles? Does your printer just need to be cleaned? Are you using an inaccurate profile? Are you using the wrong profile for the type of paper you're using, etc.? So troubleshooting that process to figure out the source of that issue. So I hope that helps you to gain a better understanding of essentially color management in the context of Lightroom, as well as, I think perhaps more importantly, or at least a lot more fun than calibrating your display. As much fun as that can be, I find it's a lot more fun to optimize my photos in Lightroom and then make some prints or share online, etc. But I hope all of the tips that I've shared today are helpful in your workflow in terms of helping to produce the best color possible in your photos. Once again, you can learn more of the video training courses that we've published, as well as Pixology magazine. Basically, everything that I publish myself is included in the Gray Learning Everything bundle, and you can get a discounted price courtesy of Xrite. Thanks again, Xrite, for hosting this webinar. Just visit timgray.me.xritegray, and that'll take you directly to the Gray Learning website with the discount automatically applied. I'd also be happy, I know we're essentially out of time, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are additional questions. So one question here, does Lightroom work in a specific color gamut? Yes, it does. Lightroom is essentially using a variation on the lab color space, on the ProPhoto RGB color space. It functions in lab as a color model, but it's ProPhoto RGB. It's actually a variation on that, but essentially you can think of Lightroom as working in the ProPhoto RGB color space. Let's see here, can one of the same adjustments in Emerge and Result? So can use the same adjustments in Emerge HDR. All of the adjustments that I've shown you here today can be used with HDR images. As many of you maybe are aware, Lightroom is able to create HDR images. You can take multiple exposures, blend them together right inside of Lightroom. If you're familiar with HDR, or high dynamic range imaging, there are essentially two steps in that process. Number one is to actually assemble the individual captures, the multiple exposures, into a single HDR image, which will be a very high bit depth image, generally speaking 32-bit per channel image. And then there's the tone mapping stage of the workflow, and that is where you're actually applying adjustments essentially to the image itself, to that HDR image. And so you can apply adjustments to that HDR image after assembling it inside of Lightroom. So in the context of Lightroom, when you're creating your HDR image, you're actually using Lightroom's develop module for that tone mapping stage of your workflow. And so yes, all of those adjustments can be used. In Lightroom, it creates a DNG file as that result. For those interested, it happens to be a 16-bit per channel floating point image as a DNG file, and then you have full access to the entirety of the develop module in terms of applying adjustments. Which web browsers do support color management? So Safari does, Chrome does, Firefox does. All three of those do. Internet Explorer, to my knowledge, still does not support embedded profiles. However, some of those web browsers have the option to turn off color management, and in some cases it's turned off by default. So I do recommend that you make sure that color management is enabled for your own browser. But again, part of the challenge here is that end users are not necessarily calibrating their displays, they're not necessarily enabling color management if it's even an option at all. And so there are some challenges inherent in sharing images where you don't control those images in terms of how they're presented. But as I mentioned, that sRGB can help with that. So I see somebody mentions that when they turned on that print adjustment setting, their particular printer refused to print. I have no idea why that would be the case. There should not be an issue at all. I would hope that that was just some sort of odd coincidence. But unfortunately, it's not an issue that I'm familiar with, but hopefully that's something that can be resolved because it can be a very helpful adjustment. But you could also use the tone curve to apply a basic adjustment, focusing it on the shadow areas just a little bit. The output option, that print adjustment option, is just kind of a shortcut essentially to an overall adjustment to the luminance, but it is specific to printing. So just again, bear in mind you might want to make a proof copy or a virtual copy if you're compensating specifically for a print. And then an excellent question actually about printing and CMYK as a color space. So CMYK, I mentioned, is the color space or the color model that's generally used for printing, and that's because printers use, generally speaking, not always and not exclusively, but generally cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks with some variations on that. So then should you be using CMYK when printing? And the answer is no. You should think of your photo inkjet printer at home as an RGB device, even though it uses CMYK inks, because that's how the software is treating the image. You'll actually get better results sending an RGB image to your photo inkjet printer than you would for CMYK. And quite frankly, my general recommendation to photographers is to not work in CMYK at all unless you absolutely have to. You're better off, generally speaking, to keep everything in RGB, only converting to the CMYK color model if you absolutely need to. Frankly, I prefer to let the printer take care of that for me if something needs to be printed by, for a book or what have you. And so work in RGB, and by the way, Lightroom is always working in the RGB color space. Let's see if we have some other questions here. So a question about color value. So there was a question specifically about the red value. So you should have a red value no higher than such and such a value. This is an extension or variation on a theme of something I hear very often. I will hear other people talking about setting your RGB values in the image so that the brightest value in the image is no brighter than whatever value they recommend, 250 instead of 255 or 245 or whatever it might be. Generally speaking, I consider that advice to be bad advice, with the understanding that it can be very good advice for very specific workflows, but as a general rule, to say that I never want to have a red value or RGB values over a certain level, you need to define the output and the limitations of that output. With typical photo inkjet printers, for example, you can get a full range of color and tonal values all the way up to maximum. Now, if it's pure white, maximum values for red, green, and blue in an 8-bit per channel model, that would be values of 255 for all three values. That means no ink is going to be put on the paper, and so you might want to limit that to 254 in order to make sure there's always at least some ink being put down on the paper, but that's based on an understanding of the behavior of your specific printer. If you're sending an image somewhere else, you should not use a generic adjustment for those images, but rather talk to the printer, get specific information. For monitor display, for example, there's no reason to limit the overall tonal range or color gamut for the image arbitrarily. So if there's advice for specific conditions, then absolutely follow that advice. But if it's just a generic never increase the value above a certain level, I would say definitely not good advice because it's not specific to a particular workflow. It's the equivalent essentially of me telling you to always increase your saturation by +20. It's fine to apply an increase in saturation by +20 for an image that needs exactly that much saturation to produce the best result, but sometimes you need to reduce saturation. So just as any general adjustment, any generalization about a specific adjustment is probably not a good rule of thumb to use. It's probably not a good adjustment to use for every single image under every single circumstance. So too, when it comes to preparing images for output, you definitely want to prepare those images specific to the output condition that you're going to be using for that image. What is the name of the memory color image? That is I'll go ahead and bring that up again. This one you can generally find pretty easily out on the internet. It is Photodisc. I'll go ahead actually and zoom in so you can see that Photodisc logo there, Photodisc with a C. So Photodisc International. So it's generally referred to as the PDI for Photodisc International Color Target. So this is one that's very helpful. I found some others available on different websites. They're generally public domain images that people make available freely for this type of purpose, but this is the one that I generally use. And any tips for someone with red-green color blindness? Unfortunately, that's not something that I'm especially familiar with, other than just understanding that it means that you're not going to be seeing the colors as accurately. But unfortunately, it's not something that I really have any level of expertise in. I know that there are tools, software tools, for helping to kind of simulate essentially soft proofing that tries to compensate for varying degrees of color blindness, but I'm afraid it's not something that I have any expertise in. And then black point compensation, that's an issue that comes up in terms of printing. So in terms of obviously black point, that relates more to the tonal values rather than the color values. And so when it comes to printing, generally speaking, my rule is make sure that option is turned on. What it does is takes black in your image and maps it to black in the output. And the value of black, sometimes it seems silly, I know. We're saying, well, what is black, what is white? They seem like they should be absolutes. But when we're printing, for example, black is the darkest value that printer with that specific ink and on that particular paper that you're printing to, the darkest value it's able to produce. And white would be defined as the color of the paper itself when there's no ink applied to it. And so obviously there can be quite a bit of variability there. So black point compensation is something that, generally speaking, I recommend turning on, and because it's going to help ensure that black equals black in the context of your specific print workflow. All right, so we've run over just a little bit. Hopefully, once again, the information presented was helpful in those answers. You can certainly follow along. You can find me online, all of the various social media websites and whatnot. And also, if you're not already receiving the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, you might want to take a look at that. If you visit asktimgray.com, you can sign up for the free daily email to question and answer email. So if you're not already receiving that, that might be helpful as well. And again, the Gray Learning video training, the Everything bundle, is available at a discounted rate. I'll bring up that link once again, timgray.me/xwritegray. That'll get you a discounted price on that Everything bundle that includes everything that I publish myself, videos and the monthly Pixology magazine and more. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you once again to Xwrite for hosting this webinar, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.